all living in my head. It's got to get out somehow.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Estrin. Susan Krawitz won the Sidney Taylor Manuscript Award for her story Viva Rose, which will be published by Holiday House in the spring of 2017. Based on her own family's history, it's an adventure that brings together a young Jewish girl with Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. I spoke to Susan by phone at her home in New York. Susan, summarize Viva Rose for us.
Well, it's a story based on true-life characters that were relatives of mine about a girl who's a child of Russian Jewish immigrants whose brother runs off to join Pancho Villa's gang. This is in 1915. She's very upset about it because she has her own issues with controlling parents. So in her attempt to get her brother to come back, sort of a blackmailing attempt, she gets herself kidnapped by him into the gang. And it's the story of her in Villa's camp trying to get home, and it's not working. Various ways that it doesn't work until finally, of course, it does, because we don't want to leave her there. It's not a nice place for a 14-year-old to be.
Okay. So can you give a little background for listeners who aren't familiar about Pancho Villa and what was going on?
The Mexican War of Independence was raging at that point. It was common people of Mexico uprising against Spanish people who had sort of taken over the land from them, and it was a serf situation, so a lot of them worked for the rich Spanish landowners. So people like Pancho Villa, the campesino, decided they'd had enough of not ever being able to own their own land and having to work for bad wages and put up with bad circumstances. And so they rose up against the Spanish-led government in an attempt to create their own government. So this just went on for years and years. I think it went on for something like 20 years. America got involved a bit by backing whoever they thought would support their interests. The thing was, the automobile had just come into use, and so had the airplane. And in fact, it was the first time airplanes were used in battle. So oil had been discovered in the Tampico Desert of Mexico, and it was very important for the U.S. to get on good terms with whoever controlled that oil field. So they backed whoever they thought was winning, and when they thought Pancho was winning, they backed Pancho. And when he attacked a ranch in New Mexico, and it was the first attack on American soil since the War of 1812, he killed a lot of people. And that put him on the bad list. They set General Pershing after him, and General Patton was part of this. This was like his first engagement. So that was the end of Pancho's favor with America. So Pancho was poor, raised on a farm, basically in serfdom, and he had some bad things happen to him. His sister was attacked by either the manager or the owner of the farm. There's different stories about it. And he killed the guy and ran off into the hills as a teenager and basically never came down, just became an outlaw. They called him the Robin Hood of Mexico because he had a real folk following. He had a rob from the rich and give to the poor reputation, but he was also incredibly ruthless. His methods of justice were kind of horrible. And it's all really well chronicled. He really curried favor with the media. He was like one of the first people to publicize war. He actually had companies make newsreels of his gang and play them throughout America. In fact, my father and great-grandmother saw one, apparently, and my father has a memory of going to a movie theater, and my great-grandmother standing up and saying, "That's my boy Abe on the screen," because she saw him there with Pancho. Anyway, and I actually put that in my book with different characters. There's actually a movie about this called Starring Pancho Villa as himself with Antonio Banderas. I think it was made in the 80s or the 90s. That is all about the movie company that comes to make a movie with Pancho and the crazy that goes on.
So you've sort of touched on this, but I know that there's a family story in the background. So did you always know that growing up, or like how did you learn about that?
My clearest first memory is going to the third floor of my great-aunt Hannah's house in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a place where we were not supposed to go as kids because the old people lived up there. But seeing a Mexican serape and a sombrero hanging in my Aunt Edie's room and kind of going, what is that doing here? It was very, very out of place. And then, the pieces of the puzzle kind of came together. I had an uncle who liked to tell us all the stories about Abraham, and he had a brother and a sister, Brother Elliot, he had a sister Rose, and they all have actually quite larger-than-life stories. So my Uncle Sheldon was about their age. He used to hang out with them when they came east to visit, and they'd bring these gifts, the sombrero, the serapes. Abe would do things like dress in full cowboy regalia and go down to the pool hall and pool shark the locals because he looked like such a rube, Who is this guy with the big hat and his funny shoes? He supposedly played chess on horseback. I don't know quite what that means. Did he have a chessboard balanced on the horn of the saddle? Was he, one of the players? I don't know. And then this legend that he rode with Pancho Villa. And not only did he ride with Pancho Villa, they said he was a double agent. He worked for the American government spying on Villa's whereabouts. Then the legend said that he had never gotten paid for his work. He vanished, and the government had looked for him for a long time to try to pay him, which sounds a little sketchy, but hey, you never know. But interestingly, my sister's an architectural historian by trade and a great researcher, and she visited San Antonio, Texas, which is where they were from, went to the library and found in the microfiche an actual story about Abe, which confirmed all the legends, including the fact that they were looking for him and couldn't find him. Confirmed the legends, gave us some new wild ones, that he had owned a mango plantation in the South Seas, and he was a gun for hire in several other wars, jailed in Panama. What a wild guy. It really jumped up and down in my imagination for probably my whole life. Like, this is such interesting material, and you have to write it. And I grew up to be a writer and an editor, and it was the first idea I ever had that said, this is a novel, you have to write this. That's kind of how that happened.
That's great. Have you written other books?
I've written a lot of genres. I'm sort of like a carpenter with a hammer, and I'm happy to bang a few nails anywhere that looks like a place. I've written screenplays and essays and a lot of journalism and ghostwritten people's memoirs. I have an adult novel that's completed. I've published fiction for children in Cricket magazine and won the Fiction Award for Highlights. But I really, really love this story. Taught me a lot in the process of writing it, and it was great to have this recognition from the Sidney Taylor Manuscript Award.
As you were researching, did you discover any aspect of the history that was particularly interesting or meaningful, or was there anything cool that you learned that you just couldn't get into the book?
I guess mostly about how my ancestors and other Jewish immigrants ended up in places like San Antonio and El Paso, Texas, which was the story of the Galveston Plan. There's this financier, Jacob Schiff, who was himself an immigrant from Europe, who saw that the eastern cities were becoming crowded, disease-ridden tenements full of immigrants, and more and more coming from Europe. And I guess President Grover Cleveland was about to shut down immigration, Jewish, Russian, Polish immigration, because of this and probably some other factors. But he stepped in with this plan of soliciting people to come to the West and enter through the port of Galveston. And they're spread out all over the country, all over the West. And I guess my grandfather was born in San Antonio, and they ended up going to Michigan City, Indiana, and then they bounced back to Brooklyn, where they were probably, they were trying to keep them out of Brooklyn, but that's where they ended up going anyway. I just thought it was so interesting how Jewish people settled the West.
So how did you do the research for the story?
I actually got this book called Insurgent Mexico by John Reed, who was a really well-known journalist, early 20th century. He was perhaps the first ever embedded journalist in a war, embedded with Pancho Villa's gang. And he wrote an entire book about it. Lucky me, because it was so helpful in every possible way. It gave a real sense of fact and dimensionality and you are there quality. He also did the same thing in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and there was a movie made of his life called Reds with Warren Beatty. So that was an amazing find in Insurgent Mexico. And then I basically cast about the internet, watched every movie ever made featuring Pancho Villa, read any book about Jewish cowboys in the West, and this article my sister found was also wonderful and helpful. She actually discovered that someone did an oral history on Abraham's sister Rose Solomon, who I chose as a viewpoint character in my story. It's in a library in San Antonio, and I would love to take a look at that because I have more stories about this family. This family is amazing. There's another brother named Elliot, and he moved to New York City. He became an actor in the early days of Broadway. He had quite a stage career, and then he moved on to Hollywood, and he became a career thug in all sorts of movies. And he was in a lot of Jimmy Cagney movies, including Angels with 30 Faces. He was unfortunately blacklisted during the communist era, moved to England to become a dialogue coach, came back in the late 60s, did a couple of more movies. One of his last movies was The Great Gatsby with Robert Redford, and he has lines, he has a role, and he was pretty stony-faced and wooden as an actor. He was not great, but there he was. It's so interesting. This family they just sort of went big, everything they did, and to have the tangibility of my uncle's stories matching up with IMDb facts about this cousin. So anyway, I have more material, and I want to read Rose's oral history because she supposedly became a cabaret singer of some kind. And, well, I'd like to see where she went. She is my protagonist, and I know the least about her.
So your story is about actual people. These are historical figures, not only the well-known Pancho Villa, but your family members. But you chose to write it as a novel. So how did you decide to do it as fiction?
I didn't know enough about what really happened in the Pancho Villa gang with Abe. So I pulled a little this from there and there from that. And the background about the Villa gang is so colorful and interesting, just wonderful material. And the people who came to join the cause were incredible. Not only John Reed, this journalist, but they had supposedly hired Butch Cassidy, who was a real guy, to teach them to blow up trains, and a variety of famous barnstormers. Tom Mix, the silent movie cowboy, legendarily, but we're not sure really, spent time in the Villa camp. It was the cool thing to do. It was like the happening, politically correct thing for young people. Let's run around in the desert and save Mexico. So I just felt like that material would be just so interesting to play with, and wondered how I could best match my family's material with it and create a story that had resonance for kids, had a through line and theme, which was, of course, as in all books of that age, it's sort of straddling childhood and adulthood, making big growth choices. Mm-hmm. The outer journey, getting kidnapped, and then the inner journey of how does that cause it to grow and change.
Very good. What else are you working on?
Well, I'm working on several projects of my own. I also work on other people's novels. I'm a developmental editor, a freelance editor for fiction and nonfiction. I specialize in children's books.
Do you have a web page about that service?
Oh, it's just my name, SusanKrawitz.com, yeah. I'm always looking for more children's books to edit because I like working on them better than anything. But don't tell grown-up writers that, but I really do.
Are you working on any other Jewish literature, either for your own writing or editing of someone else's work?
Well, just my own, a sequel to Viva Rose, roughly titled Rose in the City, which is about her going to Brooklyn and finding out the truth that her brother Elliot, who's supposedly operating a push cart on the Lower East Side, is actually push cart by day, Broadway theater by night. So, but I did give a plug to the award. I was a guest blogger at the Children's Book Academy in the fall, and I gave a big old plug. It was about to be the deadline for the Sidney Taylor Manuscript Award. So put in the URL and a little send up, and hopefully blew a few more people who didn't know about the award that way.
Good. Thank you for doing that. So is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to talk about?
I did an interesting thing in this book, which is I borrowed characters from another writer's book to people them. I have a friend and mentor named Audrey Columbus, middle grade novel writer. She won a Newbery Honor in 2001 for her book Getting Near to Baby. She wrote a series of westerns set in 1870 called The Adventures of Maud March and Maud March on the Run, and I borrowed her two protagonists, a pair of sisters named Maud and Sally, and I advanced them 50 years to the time my book takes place, and I set them in the Via's gang. I just did it for fun, but they actually ended up growing into quite interesting characters in my book that were pretty much turning point characters. So that was fun to do, to sort of do a little horizontal borrowing there.
Yeah, I've never heard of anybody doing that before. That's so interesting.
I know, it's just big. It just tickled the heck out of me to do it. And Audrey, of course, read the material and approved. You know, sometimes characters feel larger than life, and if anybody ever wants to know more about who these girls are, Maud and Sally, there's two books that tell you all about how they got the way they got. And in fact, one of their books is actually featured in this book, anecdotally. It's, you know, the cover and the title, and the book plays a purpose because one of the sisters is a writer, and she writes up their story. So that was really fun to do. And I also discovered that somebody I used in the book, a very famous rabbi at the early 20th century in El Paso named Rabbi Zelenka, my dentist was was Dr. Zelenka, and it turned out to be his grandson. So that was an interesting train of coincidence. Another interesting coincidence, I bought an old sea captain chest this fall in the Adirondacks, really old, like 1820s or 1830s. And when I got it home, I saw that there was an old newspaper inside from 1914 with a headline about General Carranza and the Mexican Revolution and a story about Pancho Villa. And all I could think was, you know, in all the gin joints in all the world, how could this one walk into mine, you know? It was pretty wild to find a story about my poncho and my Mexican War of Revolution in this totally random trunk from the Adirondacks. So that was pretty weird.
Susan Krawitz, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thanks so much, Heidi. It was fun.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.